What I realized, what philosophy and theology always had a spot for psychology, the study of the soul, the suke. But then once psychology became its own discipline, real disciplined, fruitful thought over psychology kind of dropped out of theology. But what came to be true is that there's a lot of sort of folksy ideas of what psychology is without real good thought about it. And so the retrieving theological psychology is about retrieving psychology as a subdiscipline within theology, because historically that was part of it.
Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Wehry, and I'm here today with Dr. Matthew LaPine, Director of Equipping at City Light Church in Omaha, Nebraska. And we're talking about his book, The Logic of the Body, Retrieving Theological Psychology. Dr. LaPine, wonderful to have you on today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Super fun.
So tell me, Retrieving Theological Psychology, why this book?
Yeah, so this may be a little bit of a long story, but I had some personal relationships where there was significant mental health, and I was actually studying to go into ministry. And what happened at the time was I was learning theology, and I was also kind of on the job, you might say, learning how to help someone walk through, especially obsessive compulsive disorder. And what ended up happening is there's a real tension in my theology and what I was learning about mental health. And I sat on that for about 15 years. At the time, what I was primarily interested in was epistemology and aesthetics. And so I kind of went on a journey, different places across the country, reading about those things, loved history of philosophy. And when I got to PhD work, I realized that my interests were starting to come together. So I was really interested in the nature of emotions, had been tracking the conversation between philosophers and psychologists, and was quite annoyed, honestly, because, philosophers tend to be cognitivist and tend to see that emotions are sort of information rich. In fact, people like Martha Nussbaum talk about emotions as movements of thought, and so they tend to be very cognitivist. And then psychologists, on the other hand, tend to be very, embodied, that it's the feeling of bodily changes. That's the classic William James definition. But it seemed to me that they were picking out different aspects of emotion and calling that the emotion, but actually there was a fuller picture of what was developing. But I actually was more of a cognitivist. Maybe I'm jumping ahead and even saying it that way, because I was a cognitivist. And then I had a friend come into the PhD program who had done a bunch of research on trauma. And I invited him over to my house, and we had dinner. And at dinner, at about a 2-hour, pretty intense debate about what the nature of emotion was. I was defending a cognitivist view and saying, look, it's information dense. I mean, there's so much here. And he was really pushing on trauma and embodiment. And so what I ended up doing is I was like, I wanted to write on how the Bible was formative. But then I was like, I don't even know what formation looks like and how emotions factor into that. And so I was like, I need to just solve this divide and that ended up becoming my whole dissertation, was trying to figure out what is emotion. But what it did was it actually revived some big questions that I had, and the tension between my theology and what I had dealt with mental health stuff. And so I was super grateful for the project because it solved both a personal question, but also just in feedback that I've gotten from readers around the country, it's really illuminated and clarified for a lot of people how they think about their own emotions and how they sort of work through them. And we can get into more of that practically as we go.
It sounds like, if I understand you correctly, that's not just a you thing, but that theology as a whole has a bias towards a cognitivist approach. Why do you think that is? Am I right in assuming that?
Yeah, I think that's true in the sort of circles of evangelicalism that I've been a part of. But the story is probably more complicated.
It generally is. Yeah.
Everything that I say it's more complicated. Then I don't have to keep saying that. But I think my insight was, I read Nicholas Lombardo's The Logic of Desire, which is the inspiration for the title of this. And I don't know why I did even. It was, oh, you know what? I think it was Ken Dunnington's book on addiction really mentioned that book. Um, so I was fascinated because I realized that Aquinas had a very, very rich psychology. And then I started thinking about it. I'm like, wait, I love Plato. I love Aristotle. I love the history of philosophy. And I'm like, wait, isn't this just the history of psychology? And then I realized that what happened was when psychology became an empirical discipline, theologians kind of were like, okay, we'll leave that to the psychologists. So this is why I so appreciated reading Herman Bavinck, because he's like, no, actually, I'm just going to write a whole book on that. I don't think it's been published in English yet, but it has been translated. Maybe by now it has, and I just haven't seen it. But so it seemed what I realized, what philosophy and theology always had a spot for psychology, the study of the soul, the psyche. But then once psychology became its own discipline, real disciplined, fruitful thought over psychology kind of dropped out of theology. But what came to be true is that there's a lot of sort of folksy ideas of what psychology is without real good thought about it. And so the retrieving theological psychology is about retrieving psychology as a subdiscipline within theology, because historically that was part of it.
When you say kind of these folksy ideas, are we kind of referring to pop psychology, or do you mean like something slightly different?
Well, in some degrees, I think it was kind of frozen in time. But in other ways, it sort of morphed as it went. So I mean, like older New Testament scholars, for instance, if you read them, saw emotion as something sort of tangential to moral choice. I mean, there's been a movement more recently to see, maybe it's with Piper and the recovery of Jonathan Edwards and all that, but as to see affections as more central to spirituality, right?
Yeah.
True religion consists chiefly of religious affections. So there's some tension and difference in terms of how people were treating emotion. But for me, as a guy who loved virtue ethics, I was just like, I don't know how any of this stuff over here maps with what I love in Aristotle and virtue ethics. And it seemed to me that there was some resonance with virtue ethics and mental health stuff. And I was like, those things actually should go together. I think they could go together. And so that was one way of looking at this. The book that I wrote is kind of like let's talk about how virtue ethics actually fits into the theological conversation. So.
And this, feel free to just discard this question. But you mentioned it. You talked about psychology, and then you talked about, well, it's psyche, which is the word for soul. How does that etymology and that history, what is the connection between soul and this modern study of psychology?
Yeah. Well, that's a big question.
It's a small question, right? It's not.
Yeah. I mean, psychology, the word itself is relatively recent, but the first uses were about the powers of the soul. So that word just, it was a part of anthropology at the time the word was first used. And so,
forgive me, when was it first used? Like roughly, I'm not trying to get specific dates or anything. But I don't know. Is it like 8th century? Like I literally,
I think it was 17th or 18th century.
Oh, okay. So relatively.
It was relatively recent. I need to go back and look at that. I actually, these are one of those things where I spent like a day and a half on this in my dissertation, and now I can't remember what I wrote.
Totally fair.
Probably just one footnote somewhere. I don't know. It's ridiculous. But anyway, it's relatively recent that particular word was used as a treatment of what they were studying. But I'm trying to remember what your question was here now.
Oh, so forgive me. And part of the reason this comes from.
I was going to go back and say, so one of the things that I'm doing in the first half of the book. So if you get a copy of the book, the first half is historical, essentially. So it's 400, I think, and 30 pages, and almost the first 200 is historical. And so what I'm in sort of 3 steps, what I'm doing is I'm describing the psychology of Thomas Aquinas,
Mm-hmm.
And that psychology has some distinct features that I'm trying to bring back. One of them is somebody's called my book dual process theory for Christians, which I think is right. So in other words,
I don't know what dual process is, so help
okay,
me. Yeah.
I'll explain. Yeah. What I call it is tiered psychology, where there's an upper tier and a lower tier. So again, we're talking about powers of the soul. Aquinas thought that we, at the upper tier, are thinking and choosing creatures. That's it. That's rationality. So humans use words and images and symbols to think, and it's discursive. It's one thing at a time. It's logical, right? So that's your upper level, and you're making choices like I'm going to do this or I'm not going to do that. Underneath that, he would say there's sensory perception and sense appetite. And so if you think of it like thinking and willing, there's a cognitive component and a volitional component. And then on the bottom level, there is a sensing, perceptive component that's sort of the cognitive component. And then there's also an appetitive component, like a volitional component to the bottom. And so what I'm trying to say is because there's two separate layers, those sometimes are in conflict with each other, or there's a sort of dialogue happening between the two. So, I mean, an easy example would be like when we're engaged in behaviors that we actually choose not to do, but we still do them. So,
sounds Pauline.
Yeah, it does sound Pauline, and I think Paul is doing something. So I actually have a chapter on that text. But one way of looking at it would be to say that there's some sort of psychological principle in me, which I've heard people say the white dog and the black dog. So like Satan and his demons are feeding thoughts into me about eating the donut, and then the Holy Spirit is saying don't do it or something like that. What I'm just trying to say is I'm trying to say we exist in a much more holistic way where actually that conflict is within our psyche, which doesn't mean that sin is not involved, because I think that's one of Paul's point in Romans 6-8 is that the flesh is our sort of, especially our body, like body flesh members are all through that. It's a sort of our automatic functions are habituated to the practice of sin. So I'm following Augustine and Aquinas both in calling sin fundamentally a habitus. It's a second nature that's built into us. And so and anyway, my point is, the donut example, for example, if I come and I choose not to eat donuts, but then I come into the room and I smell them and I see them, and all of a sudden my mouth is watering, there's something happening where my sort of unconscious is saying, "Ooh, that looks good," and then my appetite is saying, "You want that. You want to eat that." Does that make sense? Yeah. But at an upper level, I might say, "No, it's not good. Like it's bad for me, and therefore I'm not going to eat it." And so basically, what I'm saying is there's two sources of perception. I have a rational idea that actually I know what long-term consequences that causes for me, and so I choose not to. But then there's also this lower level that says, "Ooh, that's good, do it." Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I'm not calling that, like, I don't think that that's the same thing as our sin nature. I think our sin nature gets wired into the whole thing.
Yes.
But my point is that we actually have a slow system and a fast system. This is Daniel Kahneman's language, system 1 and system 2.
Thinking fast and thinking slow.
Yeah, thinking fast, thinking slow. Right.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm talking about when I say dual process theory. So that's the first thing is Aquinas had a dual process theory. And I think he's exactly right. And I get into that a lot more about why once I get to the constructive side. But the second thing that Aquinas does is he has a genuinely holistic account of how body and soul work together. So the history of psychology is the history of understanding where things go wrong, what it looks like to be rational, how the soul manages the body. And there's generally sort of the more Platonic perspective, which then calcifies into Cartesian dualism, which is a really hard form of dualism. I'm a thinking thing fundamentally, but then my body almost works mechanistically. And then on the other side of it would be the more Aristotelian Thomist view of body and soul, which is that the soul is what makes the body alive. So we it's a composite. It's a hylomorphic unity. So there's form and matter that come together to make me a living being. And so on that front, my soul is not just responsible for thinking, but for all of my capacities. So to be alive is to have a soul. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to bring that back, because I'm trying to step away from, I could say more about this too, but I'm trying to step away from a sort of dualism which can compartmentalize. This is soul stuff, this is spiritual stuff, and this is embodied stuff, this is physical stuff. So this is where morality lies over here in the soul stuff, and then health lies over here in the body stuff. And for mental health, that's, I think, just a huge disaster, because you're not accounting for a whole host of things which are just vital, especially in the ways in which our autonomic nervous system and our endocrine system and our immune system get impacted by our experiences. But I'm just teasing things we could talk about.
Oh yeah, no, it's great. Like, there's so many threads dangling. I don't even know what to pull on. Well, that's not true. I have immediate thing. There's this old, and for me has always been fundamentally incorrect. And I think you see this distinction between, there's a lot that you can tie in between Greek philosophy and Christian theology. But one of the ones that's always kind of been a very clear distinction is that for Socrates, really Plato, speaking through Socrates, if someone knows to do right, they will do it. And so that sin is fundamentally a problem of education. Kierkegaard attacks this directly in his concluding on scientific postscript. But that sounds a lot about what you're talking about. It's like, well, if they just knew, if they just had enough knowledge and they understood how it all links together, then they would do the right thing. And it's like, that's not helpful, a helpful approach to mental health at all. It's like, if we just stuff more knowledge in people, and then they'll just like, just talk to them about it. They'll figure, like help them figure. And it's like, you clearly have never worked with someone who has something buried deep within them.
Yeah. And where it ends up is, so if you take away these levels, like there's not two tiers to psychology, then you're left with an account of emotion, which basically sees it as something that's under your strong control. And so changing your emotions might be like changing your arm. And so it kind of dichotomizes, because you've got...
I'm sorry, can you what do you mean? Changing your emotions
like raising your arm. Yeah.
Oh,
so
I thought you were like swapping it out. I was like...
Let me just disconnect.
Okay, I'm tracking with you now. I'm sorry, that makes way more sense.
Yeah. But this kind of dichotomizes into people who think that we don't control our emotions in any sense, or we have maximal control of our emotions. And the truth is somewhere in the middle, that there are things that we can do actually that do bring about a change in how we perceive and feel. So, I mean, the health is a great example of just like, do I like running? Well, certain people will learn to love running, or I didn't say I did. I heard this guy on the radio the other day who hadn't had a donut in like 17 years. And someone was like offering him a donut. He's like, that doesn't look good to me. I've been through this with soda. Like I don't, this is bubbly that I'm drinking. I don't like Mountain Dew. I used to love Mountain Dew. When I drink it now, I'm like, ooh, wow, that is so sweet. So there's both in terms of desire and in terms of emotion, there are things that we can do that actually do move the needle, but it's not dichotomized the way that it is for a lot of people. And so what you have to do is you have to know not just that there's tiers, but how those tiers are governed. So what I'm doing constructively on the second half of the book is I'm saying that we have thoughts and choices, which are basically symbolic. We think with words largely, and underneath that is a sort of unconscious layer of understanding. So our intuitions and our ways of seeing the world are both very smart and very dumb at the same time. So One of my favorite examples is I've given in the book. I stepped out of the grocery store. I looked to the right and panicked. And the reason I panicked was because there was a guy there was a green van. The driver's door was open. A guy was standing in the door, sort of rummaging around inside. So I drove a green van, and that green van was parked where I always parked. But if you had stopped me 10 seconds before and said, "Where did you park?" I knew exactly where I parked. It was right in front.
Right.
But in that moment, my perceptive capacity saw the situation as dangerous. It saw it as somebody breaking into my car. And so for a moment, I panicked, even against my knowledge of where I parked. And so again, I'm pointing out these two systems work independently of each other. But what happens with mental illness is that we can get into situations where that panic switch is constantly tripped. So our sympathetic nervous system is working overdrive. And when you get into deep patterns of that, no matter how many positive thoughts you think, you feel really, really stuck in it. And so I'm just what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give people pathways. So the three tiers are your thought, your perception, and the way that triggers your autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. But that lower level is the sort of how those systems, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and endocrine system, are keyed to perception. So it's really, really important to understand how these layers work, because it illustrates how experience changes us. And the evangelical church has been so locked up into thinking. Thinking is what changes us, and it's true. But faith and practice are reciprocal. So if I'd stop me, PJ, if I'm talking too much. But
no, I'm laughing because I literally just the last 2 weeks I've been teaching class on technology and theology, and I've been talking about habitus. I've been talking about practice.
Right.
And I'm literally teaching this right now. This is awesome. Yeah.
So basically, what you have, one of my favorite examples here was with I think she was 6 or 7 at the time. I took my daughter to a science fair, and at the science fair there was a whole table, like you could walk around the whole circle, full of bugs that you could touch. So like you could take the bugs on your hand, and like when she started, she was extremely fearful, even of the little harmless ones. By the end, she was holding a hissing cockroach in her hand. I was not doing that, by the way. But what I was telling her is I was saying verbally to her, so she's processing this cognitively, it's not dangerous, just try it. And once she's got it in her hand, what happens is the experience teaches her, hey, it's actually not dangerous. It's just sitting here. It's doing nothing. It's not biting me. It's not trying to crawl up my arm or anything like that. And so then she put it back. And like for the next probably 4 months, my daughter is like the bug queen of our house. Anywhere there's a bug, she's picking it up. Does that make sense? And so it is possible with the interplay between our language and what we think, and then our experience, to develop new patterns of seeing and new patterns of feeling. But you have to have a psychology which integrates the fact that we have neural pathways that are plastic, and that our whole sort of capacities are bound up in our body, and takes into account things like health. I think we were talking earlier just about like the physiology of depression. It's not always that you're a gloomy person who doesn't believe that God is faithful. Sometimes it's just that you're literally not healthy, So those are the big things. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, going back to the original question, in the history of psychology, there have been thoughts that are more well developed than ours. And I was trying to get to especially the Reformed tradition, talk about up to Calvin, how we got to the spot where we have this broken or disconnected psychology, and try and offer a new model.
And so you talked about the discursive layer, and then you talked about the sensory perception layer, and then you also talked about the sensory appetite. So you've talked about 2 layers, but it also seems like there's a third layer.
Well, no, it's intellect and will at the top.
Okay,
and,
intellect and will,
and they're those are not in dialogue with each other. The will just is the intellect's appetite, and the intellect is just the will's information. So it's this is the Thomistic view. Isn't colored by the intellectualism voluntarist controversies. There's a whole chapter on that.
Yeah.
But there's a cognitive and an appetitive part up here that we just experience as thinking. On the bottom layer, there is a perceptive part and an appetitive part, which when we see something, we don't think, oh, that's good, I should feel this way. We just experience it as dangerous or as attractive. Does that make sense? So
is there ever any disconnect between those two? Between the sensory perception and the sensory appetite?
Not in how I'm framing it. No. Okay. So it's they're unified on both levels. So we experience them as one thing. So this goes back to Kantian philosophy and the way that our perception is actually actively formed as we look at things, right?
Yeah.
Even the green van example. You can think of that for a second. That was against my understanding of where I parked my car, and it was a really, really intelligent thing, right? It knew what a van was. It knew what color my van was. It knew how much I valued my van was and how much I valued possessions and how I, estimated my chances in a physical altercation against this person. All of these things happened in a split second without thinking that were just assumed things that actually ran against where I knew I parked my van. So I saw that situation as dangerous without thinking about it. In fact, the low road runs to my amygdala and makes me do this, startle, before I even am aware of what's happening. And that's Joseph Ledoux's neuroscience. I'm saying those things, the appetite and cognition, they go together, but they can only be in dialogue if it's separate systems. And I actually think that's it's a really important part, even about understanding thinking. Thinking itself is searching the unconscious to try and make it explicit. And then feeling, I would say, is my unconscious and my bodily systems in conversation. So
you don't need to make things explicit if they're working.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I've just been working through, I don't know if you know the name Vygotsky. He did developmental theory for psychology.
Okay.
But he had a partner because he was writing against very quantified, very structuralist psychology. And so the idea was to quantify everything. And then he had a partner who said, you know what, I'm going to try and record every single behavior that someone does. And he sat and he watched his wife for 20 minutes making dinner, which first off, anyways, I don't know what that says about him and his marriage, right? I'm like, I don't know if my wife, I'm sitting here observing my wife. Yeah. But in 20 minutes, he recorded 480 distinct, by his own system, never mind how you could break it down, 480 distinct behaviors. And it becomes immediately, so part of what you're saying is we have to be able to critique, problematic sensory perception and appetite, but we also need to recognize that it's doing good things too. And I think that goes back to you talk about people need to understand how it works. I just hit my mic. Nice. People need to understand how it works, but they also need to understand the value of each piece.
Yeah. There's a book called Strangers to Ourselves by Timothy Wilson, and he talks about just how much our unconscious is doing. He's most of the information that we process is unconscious, the vast majority, over 95%. And a lot of that is filtered out, when it never comes to our attention.
Right.
But you can see this illustrated. Imagine someone who got mugged. The way that they walk down the street will be different than the way that I walk down the street not having been mugged. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because unconsciously, I'm going to be filtering out as irrelevant certain things that their unconscious will say, oh, that's relevant. You need to pay attention to that.
Your examples are coming from counseling and trauma, but for our listeners, this is just everything we do. So, for instance, when you talk about pointing, like that's something kids just learn automatically. No one ever teaches them how to point. And even as I say pointing, if our if our audience is American, they're thinking of like this.
Yeah.
But I had a missionary friend who was the first Westerner to go into Cambodia after the Pol Pot regime.
Yeah.
And it's very rude to use your finger. They point with their lips.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is like, yes, I know. So I didn't realize how weird that looked until I was teaching about it. And I did that and everyone started laughing. I was like, what?
Right.
That's what they do, right? Like to them, they would be very offended if we were using a finger.
Yeah.
And no one, not a single person listening to this who has not been exposed to Cambodian culture was thinking of pointing with your lips. That would literally, you know what I mean? Like, what?
Totally,
and so it doesn't have to be traumatic, though, of course, trauma reinforces and builds these kind of structures very quickly. Well, but it's just basic human psychology.
And there's probably within the culture a sophisticated way of even reading how someone's using their lips.
Yes,
that
100%.
We would have no visual understanding of how to process, right? It would take years and years to develop that capacity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Behind the scenes of all of this, for me, is Michael Polanyi's personal knowledge, and especially his understanding of the tacit and the from and to. People ask me, like, who's your biggest philosophical influence? Is Michael Polanyi. But Michael Polanyi, I think is clear that he's not talking about the unconscious, but I think he's talking about the unconscious. But the unconscious is one of those things that is really, really hard to talk about without thinking about Sigmund Freud. The modern adaptive unconscious. Timothy Wilson's probably the most accessible book on it. But we have so much knowledge that we can't say, that we can't put into words. How do you know someone's face? Just go ahead and try and describe that for me. How do you identify someone by their face? You can't say.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Esther Lightcap Meek?
Oh yeah.
She's been a guest on the show. So when you said Michael Polanyi, I was like, oh, okay. It's a lot of connections.
No, that's one of the reasons I said yes here. Is that I was like, oh, Esther's been on it. That's great. Yeah. No, she's fantastic.
Yeah. No, really enjoyed it. And of course, could immediately see. Yeah, he doesn't call it the subconscious, but you're like, these are or unconscious, which that's a whole other thing. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to lose all our time here. I want to talk about, like, we've talked around your book, but when you talk about what is the trajectory from Aquinas to Calvin, and how do you see that play out in modern day theology?
So,
well, let me limit that. Yeah. Modern day Protestant American theology, because that's very different from Roman Catholic theology, which is still very thoroughly Aquinas.
Yeah, and they're way ahead of us in psychology. I mean, just you look at Roman Catholic books, and they've been down this path for a while. But I would say so. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to describe. I tried very hard not to sort of turn this into like a whodunit on virtue ethics, but it is kind of that. So I just noticed
who murdered virtue ethics.
Yeah, who murdered virtue ethics? Yeah, and it's not just one person, unfortunately. But so I was reading, actually. So I loved Aquinas' psychology, and I was reading Calvin's psychology, and I was like, this just seems like a total mess. And I was supposed to give a paper at a conference on Calvin's psychology, and I was like, I don't understand even who he's interacting with. And so I basically started like looking back into medieval psychology and trying to figure out who his conversation partners were, and that's what became a chapter. But anyway, I'm wasting time.
No, you're good. No, this is the best part. Not the best part. This is the good part.
I tried to identify 4 features in Aquinas that were really important for a sort of virtue ethics friendly view that also makes sense of mental health. One was that human nature is a composite, that there's plasticity in our physical bodies. Number 2, that psychology was tiered. So I've talked about those already. Number 3, that the higher faculties govern the lower. So actually, this is interesting because Jonathan Haidt has done a lot of work in The Righteous Mind, and he has some principles of moral psychology. he would recommend, he would be a guy who is doing almost the same thing I am, but from a Humean perspective, David Hume. Mm-hmm. So for him, intuitions come first and thinking comes afterward. And my big critique on that is, yes, in the moment, but overall we're governed by our thoughts. So what I'm saying is the higher faculties actually do govern the lower, because I can think things and I can make choices. And I think that's really important for Christian theology, because God is a speaking God and we're listening and responding creatures. But then fourth is that humans can possess imperfect virtues by common grace. And so, if I work out regularly, the composition of my body is going to change. And health is a sort of imperfect habit that, according to Aquinas, but it's also true in, if I move towards the lowly and prioritize them and honor them and spend time with them, I will begin to see people differently, and I'll begin to respond automatically differently. So
yes,
that was basically the what was happening there. What I tracked then was what happened in between was developments in how body and soul were viewed, and in general, to summarize a long chapter, it moved towards away from a holistic account of body and soul to a much more sort of dualistic it was well on its way to Cartesian dualism before it ever got to Calvin. And I could talk more about that, but that's more boring stuff. But what eventually happened was these lower powers, these passions, they became downgraded as part of our irrational bodies. And so they're no longer in the realm of what's moral. And then
we're still in Aquinas with that.
No, that's in between Aquinas.
In between Aquinas and Calvin. So this is people changing what Aquinas has said.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean they're working through what the powers of the soul are. So how many forms are this is. Are there multiple souls within a person? Are there multiple forms within a person? What is the relationship between the soul and the powers? And then how do you defend the immortality of the soul? From people began to think, well, Aristotle's too ambiguous on this. We need to go with Plato. And anyway, there's a whole thing that you can look at.
Who are some names there, if you don't mind my asking, just so that we can.
Yeah, I mean, probably the most important one is Buridan. There gradually came to be a sort of Buridan consensus as to how the soul interacted with the powers. So it was assumed that the soul just is its powers, and then the powers have to simplify as a result. And then the things that used to be part of the soul's powers get relegated to the body. So but I think Buridan's the most important person. In the immortality debate, there's Alexandrianism and Avarism, and then Ficino. I think that's how you say it. He's advocating for a more Platonistic view of the soul, and so there's a Platonic resurgence of the soul. But really, I could probably give you some book recommendations that would be more helpful.
Yeah.
Than just a few of those names. But the other thing that happened in between was they fundamentally changed how the will works. So. Shortly after Aquinas, maybe it was shortly after his death, Aquinas' view of the will came to be condemned as too much like Socrates. Reason captures the good and the will automatically moves toward it. Yes. I don't think that was Aquinas' view, but he was accused of being an intellectualist.
Well, and forgive me, in the middle of this too, because these are fundamentally theological debates because of the time period, the Christology is going to be an important, right? Like there's like that heretic, it's like, well, you can't, like there are whole avenues blocked off because it's like, well, that affects with the doctor, right? Am I right in that? Like,
yeah, that's true. I don't get into any of that, but
right. Because they don't get into that, but it is important to know, like, well, why didn't they just think about this? It's like, well, there's the nature and the unities. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
So what's the status of a dead body? What makes it a body? Something like that, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway,
well, that's the immortality thing too, right?
Or whose body is it?
Yeah. There's these limitations because of orthodoxy. Yeah.
But the changes in the will largely I think it comes to be seen as sort of like a homunculus, like a separate person almost. Like if you have conflict between the intellect and the will, you're treating them both as if they have independent sources of the capacities of the other. So a will can't contradict the intellect unless they both have ideas. And
Right.
a will can't war against the reason unless they both have desires. So
Yes.
Calvin talks a lot about how our wills, not a lot, but sometimes about how our will and reason fight with each other. And that assumes that they each have appetite and cognition. So that was one of the, I think they turn the will into almost a whole agent. And the reason why they do is they want to say the will has the capacity to choose against reason. So reason identifies this as good and the will can say nope or yep. Does that make sense?
Yes. Is that? Do you think that they're taking the dual tier approach and they're just pushing it back up into the top tier? Okay.
Yeah. That's my theory. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're also expanding some of the powers of the will. So this is Anselm's two appetites, and Scotus was a big advocate of this. So there's the sort of the natural appetite, and then there's the appetite for justice, which restrains the natural appetite. But one of probably the biggest thing that happens with the will is that the will comes to be seen as the most important thing about the will is that it can freely choose. And so they locate free choice entirely in the will. And what that does is it basically eliminates any need for virtue. In fact, virtue would be an obstacle to free choice. So you basically, what virtue was for Aquinas, it was the quality, the habit of the powers that made them together work well and easily toward a good choice.
Yeah.
So
it's kind of
I see the donut.
Would it, like an inscribed internal structure that predisposed you.
That predisposes you to choose good. So
yes.
I see the donut. I'm not overwhelmed by strong appetite because I see it with the eyes both of taste and moderation at the same time.
Yes.
And so then I can choose freely to not partake because I've already had 3 or something like that.
That was not what I was expecting.
Yeah, but so my point is, virtue is the quality of the working of each of those 4 sort of aspects of our psychology, such that the good choice becomes easy and the bad choice becomes hard, and vice would be the opposite. So if the most essential characteristic of the will is that it can freely choose, then virtue and vice have basically no function like in any particular moment a virtuous habit, or a vicious habit. Or I guess this is Ian Drummond's dissertation. I've forgotten the name right now, but the virtue becomes a feature of the will, and it sort of sets you up for the Calvinist understanding of the bound will is the one that's bound by sinful appetite, and it requires the Spirit's sort of freeing up to choose otherwise. Does that make sense?
Yes.
But the structure of the will is such that the will is its own chooser. It's almost like it's its own agent.
Are you familiar with Jean-Paul Sartre, Being in Nothingness? So he has this idea of like negative freedom. I can explain it pretty quickly. The important thing for him was that we always have complete and total freedom because we can completely negate the past, which I remember reading that and thinking that's absolutely crazy. And I think he's kind of fallen off in part because he is having this volunteerist position as if at any moment he's like, people are afraid of their freedom, their ability to, and it's like, it's that enlightenment idea of like we have so much control and so much power, when in fact, like if you're constantly changing what you're doing, you're like that. We know what that person's like. That person's annoying because they're like, oh, I'm doing this today. Oh, I'm doing this today. And it's the continual repeated actions and the what it carves for us that makes the difference. And so, I mean, that's kind of the ultimate expression of that.
It's the freedom from or freedom for distinction, right? So I don't actually want to be free from all internal constraints. Like I would love to have some internal constraints which are really healthy, because I mean, I think about this in terms of like, I took 3 weeks worth of piano lessons, and the only thing I can remember is 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 4, 3, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 1. And, but so I don't have the internal habits that allow
Yes.
me to play Clair de Lune. So I am free from constraint in one sense, but I'm not free to do good in terms of, on the piano. And I think that's, I would love to see a deeper understanding of the fact that being enslaved to Christ is freedom.
Yeah.
Because it's freedom to walk in holiness and joy, and to not be enslaved to all the vicious habits that we have embodied in a deep way, just living in the world as sinful creatures.
So we have these internal structures, and you can call them habits, but it's really expansive, right? Like it's this whole internal
Habits of
structure.
seeing, habits of reacting, habits of thinking, habits of choosing.
You
Even
mentioned
embodied habits
habitus,
like health.
right? Like that's
Habitus, yeah.
that whole
Second nature. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And so when we talk about putting off the old man and putting on the new, you see maybe not 100%, or would you? Like there's definite crossover there. Is that kind of what we're talking about? Is that Christ is reinscribing new structures inside us?
Yeah, I think in Romans 6, there's clearly 2 beats to Christian sanctification, which is we reckon ourselves dead to sin and alive to God. So there's a new way of framing. It's Romans 12 too. We renew our minds. So we think of ourselves different. We think of how we relate to God, Jesus, God different, and we're in Christ, and we've put on His life, and we died with Him in baptism. We're raised with Him. But then we present our body parts, like literally our members, the members of our body, as instruments of righteousness, which leads to our sanctification. And so that it's that thought and practice duality, that sort of reciprocating spiral. But then obviously there's something missing, because we see this difficulty that exists in us still as we try and do this. And you get to Romans 8, and it talks about how actually the key here is that when you're in Christ, you have the Spirit.
Yes.
And the Spirit is the one who brings our mortal bodies to life. And if He can do that, like He raised Jesus from the dead, He can do that in our physical bodies also. But there's an already not yet expectation that we who have the first fruit of the Spirit, we still groan, awaiting the redemption of our bodies. So I think it's really, really, if you read 6 through 8 and underline body, flesh, members every time you see it, I think you get a much clearer picture of what Paul's doing. It's a deeply embodied account of spirituality that he gives there.
Which, and of course, the West has always struggled with understanding the significance of the incarnation apart from the cross. And so do you think part of what you're doing is reappropriating the significance of the incarnation and Christ's obedience?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I don't have fully developed thoughts on this, but I find Colossians fascinating, because Paul's really, really leaning into this, right? The fullness of God it was there in Jesus, and that fullness is also in us as we belong to each other. This is Colossians 2, like 17 through 19, where it talks about pushing away asceticism. And instead, what you do is you hold to the head, which is Christ, and from whom the joints and ligaments all strengthen each other. And so Paul even says that I'm filling what's lacking in Christ's sufferings on your behalf. Here I am embedded, my body in the body, serving other Christians as a way of the sanctification of the body, all because the fullness of God dwelt bodily in Christ, and we are attached to Him.
So we talked a little bit, and I feel like this is still all part of the Calvin discussion. As we move from Aquinas to Calvin to kind of modern day American Protestant theology.
Yeah.
What are some of the applications that you see? What are some of the gaps that you are addressing? Yeah.
Well, I think that probably the first thing and most important thing for me is just the sort of liturgy of obedience. There's a sort of Paul says it in Romans 12 as a sort of reasonable service. Like I think that we talk about obedience as if it's the overflow of the heart sometimes, which I grant that it is, but it's also it's practice. So a practice is something that I do not just for the sake of doing it, but for how it works back on me. It's the same thing. It's that the middle voice, right? I clothe myself. So that's Paul's language of putting on or putting off, right? So I think that Paul sees his theology and his ethics as integrally connected in part of the formative process. And I think we sometimes miss that. We become too cognitive about it. We think that as long as I change my thoughts, then my heart will change and then my actions will change. And I'm just saying full participation in Jesus involves thoughts and fully embodied participation in the life of Jesus within the church. And that involves not just my own individual life, but also the social life as the Spirit distributes the gifts to the different members for strengthening. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I just recovering the place of obedience within community is probably the first and most significant one. But I think the one that I've been moving to a lot more recently is also just understanding why people are where they are. As I've, when I'm looking at let's say anxiety, what I'm afraid of is I'm afraid of a posture which says, now I wonder if this is sin or if this is like a chemical imbalance. Like that's a sort of guilty until proven innocent approach to mental health, which doesn't reflect the reality of mental health. But if you talk to someone who has generalized anxiety disorder or OCD or something like that, and you hear more about their story, you're going to find that there's a lot more going on with it. And I think that's churches often sort of valorize people who have a stable upbringing as being the most righteous. Like there's sort of who we put forward, and in some ways that's true. Like emotional stability and self-control and all these things are important fruits of the Spirit. But it's also important to understand that that the community someone was raised in is an important part of what forms them, and there's courageous, faith-filled, spirit-filled transformation that happens in people who have been significantly abused. If you look at ACE scores, which is adverse childhood experiences, if you're 4 or higher on ACE scores, your health outcomes and your mental health outcomes are just devastating. And so I think we just need to do a better job of understanding where people are coming from and why. And honestly, that raises the stakes for us in terms of what it looks like to live a community of holiness and righteousness. Like we are cultivating each other in how we treat each other. And it raises the stakes for how we interact with people by giving honor and offering the welcome that Christ gives, and how we care and how we listen. And so I just think that part of understanding how people got where they are is also understanding our responsibility to cultivate peace in others by how we engage with them. Like I'm much more communitarian in how I look at the church. The church is not just a bunch of people who come together weekly to worship God alongside each other and then go about their business. The church is a social group, and the social group matters because it's the body of Christ. Like we're connected to Him, we're connected with one another. Each of us contributes by the gifts that we give to each other. And so read 1 Corinthians 12 and ask yourself, is this what my church looks like? Do we give more honor to the weaker members, the less presentable members, so that there will not be division, so they don't feel overlooked and left out,
And I know that you said that you think cognitive comes first or governs first, but it also seems like,
in a broad sense, over time, our thoughts and choice govern how we come to be formed. But I'm also adding in this social component, and part of that has to do with human beings sit both on in the higher level as we talk to each other and in the experiential register. So if I say God loves you, and then scream at you, you might know what the words God loves you mean, but you might not you might not experience that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, you're not going to understand it the right way.
Right.
Part of this is, as you've talked about, I think a lot of times it's, well, you need to listen to preaching and you need to speak truth to yourself. You need to go to therapy. But
Yep.
seeing spiritual practices like the Lord's Supper, like gathering, like singing,
Right.
fasting and giving, and all these things, which are bodily, more embodied practices, would also be, you would, from what I understand what you're saying, those
Yeah.
would be
Breaking
very
bread. Confession. Yeah.
helpful mental
Yeah.
health
These are
things.
formative.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And I think that probably if I were to put a finger on the biggest single cause of our situation today in terms of mental health, it's that almost all of the the depression and anxiety spike that we've seen recently is addiction and isolation.
Right.
So we are not vitally connected to each other, and because of that, or that's a contributing factor to us just digging full scale into addictive behaviors, whether that's just scrolling Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is. But we're not vitally connected in spiritual relationships. And I think, I mean, Johann Hari wrote a book called Lost Connections, which he gets into all this. And I love the first half of the book. Second half of the book, whatever. I skipped it, but I skipped most of it.
I thank you for saying that. No one ever admits to that, right? Like you're like,
Well,
first half's great, second half's just skip it. It's not worth it.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Mortimer Adler taught me to use books, but the issue, part of the issue is that he's not writing from a Christian perspective. And so he's nailing the problem. The problem is that we're designed to be in relationship with God, relationship with other people, in relationship with meaningful work within creation. And if I'm not in vital relationships in that way, then I'm going to be suffering. and the link between suffering and anger or violence or depression or anxiety is huge. When we have to learn that our ultimate hope is found in God, but the means of grace are also partly the church that He's given us and the calling that He's given us to love and serve others. That those are healthy things to engage in. So,
this has been awesome. I really appreciate it. As a final, I want to be respectful of your time. As a final question, besides buying and reading your excellent book with a gorgeous cover, I love this whole series. I'm always a fan of like cool paintings on the front.
They did a nice job.
What would you recommend to somebody who has listened to us for the last hour to either do or meditate on or over the next week?
Yeah. I mean, I think probably the first thing I would say is, those three avenues that I just talked about, relationship with God, like for me personally, the last few years have been a pathway of saying, do I find ultimate rest in you? Like, it's been kind of a difficult few years, but like just literally in prayer, opening my hands and saying, not my will, but your will be done, and finding my rest in my Heavenly Father has been really, really vital. So how do you assess yourself? Can you say to live as Christ and to die as gain? Can you say that you've learned the secret of contentment because the one thing that you want is to know Christ and the power of His resurrection and the fellowship of His sufferings, like Paul does in Philippians? Like what are your practices of relating to God? Maybe also, secondly, then assess like, who are the three people that I have vital and intimate relationship with? Who are the 15 people that I'm in community with, and who's the group that I'm a part of that I get a broader sense that I have a shared mission with? So like how spiritually vital are my friendships? And then lastly, what's my understanding of my vocation? I think a lot of sort of run-of-the-mill, not like extremely complex mental health issues, but a lot of the run-of-the-mill mental health issues can be improved slowly over time by assessing where I am on those axes, how I relate to God in a primary sense, how I relate to others, and how I relate to meaningful work in creation. If you find yourself spending 6 hours a day on your phone, these things are going to be hindered. And so do that assessment. Ask yourself, am I walking with God in deep dependence? Am I walking with others in deep interdependence? And am I building meaningful things in the real world?
Awesome. Dr. LaPine, absolute joy having you on today. What just like, it's such an actionable and practical ending. So I appreciate it. Thank you.